Hello, everyone. I'm Alan Winters. I'm one of the co-directors of the Centre for Inclusive Trade Policy, and welcome to our webinar series. Today, I'm very pleased to have Marzia Fontana talk to us about how can inclusive trade include people with disabilities, and she can tell you a little bit about the background of that study if she wants. Marzia is a development economist of 25 years standing or so, and I'm actually proud to say that I was one of her supervisors when she did her PhD here in Sussex. So Marzia and I go back quite a long way. She's worked primarily on areas of intersecting inequalities, labour markets and international trade, and is very widely published on gender equality and economic policy. So she's exactly the right person to bring this topic to us. She's also had extensive experience with international organizations and bilateral aid bodies. Marzia, welcome. Thank you very much. Let me hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Alan, for this introduction, and thank you for inviting me to your webinar series. Now I'm going to share my screen and will start my slides. Fantastic. So thank you again. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to discuss this important issue of disability inclusion in the context of international trade. This is an issue which is very poorly documented, not clearly understood, and I really do hope there will be an opportunity for increasing the visibility of this issue in both research and policy debates. So yes, let me give you a little background on how this report came about. The report I'm presenting was commissioned by the government of Finland, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and is the result of a collaboration between many insightful colleagues. So persons with disability are among the most disadvantaged groups, and many of them live in low and middle income countries. They are disproportionately represented among the poor, and very few have actually access to employment opportunities. The government of Finland is strongly committed to disability inclusion and has promoted over the years a number of projects in support of the realization of disabled people rights. Finland has also quite a dynamic sustainable trade unit, and they felt it was important to integrate issues of disability inclusion in their trade work. This stemmed from the observation that current debates on inclusive trade seem to only pay lip service to the need to extend the benefits of trade to persons with disabilities. Key reports on inclusive trade make only vague reference to persons with disabilities listed as one of many disadvantaged groups, but with no specific analysis on what might be the relevant issues, the trade relevant issues to them. So the Sustainable Trade Unit approached me and other colleagues to ask to help them to try and develop a disability inclusive aid for trade agenda. So this would involve raising awareness among aid for trade stakeholders, encourage dialogue between two communities which usually do not speak with each other very much, the disability community on one side, the trade community on the other, and broadly encourage also further research and policy actions to promote the rights of persons with disability in the context of international trade. It's the area is a new area of work for me. I've been concerned about distributional effects of trade for a long time, but I knew very little about the economic situation of persons with disability. I've learned a great deal thanks to many insightful and supportive colleagues. And this is to say that the report has been a real collective effort. It has produced interest, including at the UNCTAD, at the ILO. A new working group has just been created to continue work on these themes, but we are still at early stages. So I'm going to take you through some of the main contributions and ideas in the report. In the report, we aim to answer 3 questions. So first, what is the best way of thinking about the linkages between trade and persons with disabilities? To this end, we develop a simple but a clearly structured framework to guide both research and policy action. The second question is, what is currently being done on the ground in low-income countries in particular? And what insights can projects on the ground offer to help in improving the situation of persons with disabilities in the context of trade expansion? So we undertook extensive stakeholder consultations. We found that little is being currently done, but nonetheless, there are useful lessons to be learned. So then we used the insights from these exercises to formulate initial policy recommendations for advancing a disability inclusive aid for trade agenda aimed at Finland, but also at the broader AFT community. Last point, this is not in the report, but as a way of concluding my presentation today, I'd like to offer a few suggestions for further research that have been emerging from conversations with various colleagues, and I'd really like to hear your ideas and feedback. So first of all, it might be useful to clarify how the report defines the concepts of disability on one side and trade on the other. As for the concept of disability, the report is aligned with the 2006 UN Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is a landmark piece of legislation that sanctions the protection and promotion of the rights of persons with disabilities. It has been ratified by many countries, most countries, and this convention really sort of signal a shift from a medical understanding of disability, where the focus is on some adverse characteristics of individuals that therefore deserve some form of social assistance, to a human rights approach, which emphasizes the rights of persons with disabilities to participate fully in economic, political, social life on equal basis as others. So the convention defines persons with disabilities as persons who have long-term physical, sensory, mental impairment, which in interaction, and that's important, with barriers in the environment, which can be physical barriers, attitudinal barriers, institutional barriers, may undermine their full participation in society. In the report, we acknowledge that persons with disabilities are a very diverse group with diverse needs, and I hope to return to this issue later in the discussion. And we also stress that disability is universally relevant because any of us can develop different kinds of functional difficulties of our lives. Just a few days ago, someone, I think, said that there's no such a thing as abled bodies, but we are all bodies which are not yet disabled. So this is something that sooner or later all of us is going to experience. So in conclusion, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability reminds us that persons with disabilities must be recognized as active participants in the economy, as workers, consumers, rights holders entitled to public services, not as a group merely in need of social assistance. And so the main focus of policy must be on increasing, including trade policy, must be on increasing the resources to improve the physical and social environment and reduce barriers to enable persons with disability to live an independent life and to participate in the economy. So now to trade. The term trade policies in the report is used in a very broad meaning to include not only tariffs on goods and export promotion, but also service liberalization, investment liberalization, and all sorts of regulations and standards that nowadays tend to be included in the text of trade agreements. Often in the report, when we say trade policies, actually we mean something more than trade policies. We sort of include also the whole set of complementary policies that would be required to ensure that the benefits of from trade are more widely shared and do not lead to inequitable outcomes. And we argue that aid for trade has an important role to play in supporting these complementary policies. So now to the analytical framework, we draw on established approaches for assessing the distributional outcomes of trade and identify three main channels of transmission between trade policies and the well-being of persons with disabilities. These three channels are employment, consumption, and public provision. We also include digitalization that we do not treat really as a channel in itself, but as an underlying process, which is obviously transforming international trade and affecting the distributional impact of trade via the three main channels of employment, consumption, and public provision. We hope, we would like the framework to serve two purposes. One is to help collecting evidence in a systematic and a more systematic way on how persons with disabilities are affected by trade. And the other is to help identify the conditions that are needed to ensure that the design and implementation of trade policies and complementary policies contribute to the realization of the economic rights of persons with disabilities. So, an employment channel. The employment is obviously an important channel. This audience probably know very well that so the trade generates new jobs in some sectors, but also destroy jobs in other sectors. And even if there is a net job creation due to trade, different categories of workers will be differently affected depending on skills, gender, place of residence, and so on. A rich body of research by now shows that jobs generated along global value chains involve a combination of permanent and casual employment under various contractual arrangements. So there are the good jobs associated with production in global value chains, but sometimes also bad jobs. And so given this kind of scenario, the important question for us is to ask, and so to understand where workers with disabilities are likely to be found in this complex web of employment relations. Very little is known about the extent to which workers with disability participate in global value chain. And this is certainly a very important priority area for research, in my view. From what we know about the difficulties the workers with disabilities have in accessing secure, well-paid jobs in general, so basically only 36% of workers with disability are employed, and this compare globally, this compare with about more than 60% for the non-disabled population, and they are very much concentrated in informal employment, especially in low middle income countries. For example, they are disproportionately represented in home-based, subcontracted industrial work. So based on what the very little we know, it's plausible to assume that unless appropriate policies are implemented, persons with disability risk to remain confined to insecure jobs at the bottom of value chains, mostly as micro-entrepreneurs or agriculture laborers. So persistent barriers in training on relevant skills, finance, a lack of adequate transport, stigma in the workplace and the wider society, risk preventing persons with disability access good jobs, the good jobs created in trade-related sectors. In recent years, a number of programs have been developed, and in low-income countries, they start to address some of the specific barriers faced by micro-entrepreneurs and smallholders with disabilities, mostly in agriculture and textiles. The most successful of these projects involve collaboration between different organizations, stakeholders, organizations of persons with disabilities, the government, the private sector, and they tend to follow a holistic approach to the multiple barriers that are faced rather than focusing on one single issue. This is, of course, a good start, but we argue that more measures and initiatives are required to improve the working conditions of workers in disability in occupations and sectors where they already work. But we also say that policy efforts are needed also to improve access of persons with disabilities to jobs in higher value-added segments of global value chains, let's say managerial position in ICT, green industries, sustainable tourism, and so on. With regard to the second channel, consumption, trade affects the prices and quality of goods available in a country. Different groups and individuals are going to be affected differently by changes in the cost of living, depending on their circumstances and income. So we identify three kinds of goods that are especially relevant to persons with disabilities: food, medicines, and assistive technology. So if greater trade integration improves the availability and affordability of food and medicine, this is obviously important for the well-being of everyone, particularly low-income groups, but can be especially beneficial for persons with disabilities who are more likely to live in food insecure households and often also experience complex long-term healthcare needs. And then there is assistive technology, which is of specific relevance to persons with disabilities. So this is, again, an area I didn't know much about, and I've learned a great deal. It's quite interesting and fascinating. So assistive technology products include a diverse range of goods, from hearing aids, wheelchairs, screen readers, fall detectors, artificial limbs, and so on. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability talk about AT as an important enabler because assistive technology can enable people to live more independent lives and could also, in principle, enable workers with disability to become more productive, access training, different type of occupations, and access, in general, more dynamic jobs generated by trade. So it's AT is an enabler, but AT is also a good trade opportunity. So reports note that currently the bulk of production and international trade in IT takes place among high-income countries, and often IT products are not adapted to the needs of people living in low and middle-income countries. Think about wheelchairs that are not well designed for the terrain of rural Malawi. There are also often problems with components which cannot be produced locally, and lack of repair services. So I think that if technical assistance could be directed at building local low and middle income countries' productive capacity, fostering a South-South cooperation in the production of AT spare parts, assistance with service repairs, this could go a long way in addressing the unmet needs of AT in many low-income countries. I'm going to, obviously, in terms of thinking about these issues in relation to trade, we also need to understand that there's a variety of products in terms of product sophistication, organization of production, possibly intellectual property rights around them. And I'd like to go back to these issues in my last slide. But now let's move on the last channel, which is the public provision channel. Trade can affect the ability of national governments to reduce barriers the person with disabilities face in accessing physical infrastructure. Think about transport, sanitation, and health and care services, among others. And this is because trade reforms might affect the level of government revenue, although this is used to be more relevant perhaps in the past than now, since tariffs now tend to be much lower everywhere. Trade kind of regulations can also determine or affect the conditions under which public services can be subcontracted to private firms, including foreign ones. So the effects can be positive. For example, they might lead to a better enforcement of accessibility standards in transport and other infrastructure, but can be also negative. If there's a risk, they undermine provision of health services to people who need it the most. So in the report, we argue, therefore, that it's important that the international trade commitments are aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals and obviously with the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. In other words, the aim is to ensure that the government maintain its capacity to regulate basic services for legitimate social goals. Digitalization, as I said, we see that as a kind of an underlying process. Digital labor platforms, e-commerce, digitally delivered services create both opportunities and challenges. Some barriers might be reduced related to mobility, for example, but others may increase. It's very possible that a business run by person with disability, because of small size, limited access to infrastructure, will find difficult to compete with large e-commerce companies. So moving forward, it's important to keep in mind that the disability digital divide remains wide, and that regulatory matters on these activities are rather complex because they tend to operate across multiple borders. UNCTAD is doing quite a lot of interesting work on these matters of digitalization in relation to international trade, which is not specific to persons with disability, but could be also relevant to some groups. We conclude this exercise by noting that these elements of the framework are all interconnected. We draw a checklist of desirable actions and measures to help individual countries with identification and monitoring. But we also obviously recognize that priorities will be context specific and may vary by country. Now moving on our review of what is currently being done on the ground. We undertook, as I said at the beginning, extensive stakeholder consultations about initiatives in a variety of settings and countries. And our conversations with colleagues pointed to 3 key areas where action is most urgently needed. These are improving terms of inclusion of workers with disability in global value chains, increasing production, trade, and use of assistive technologies, and reducing the disability digital divide. As for the features of initiatives on the ground that seem to be working, we find that holistic approaches, what is called ecosystem approaches, also that aim to tackle multiple barriers, physical infrastructure, access to finance, access to skills, provision of assistive technology, and so on. These kind of multiple holistic approaches seem to work more effectively than initiatives that focus on single issues. The involvement of persons with disability and their organizations is essential in deciding priorities and designing interventions, but OPDs often do not have sufficient resources and are not well equipped to carry out tasks. Projects that bring together persons with disability and persons without disabilities tend to work more productively, more effectively than sheltered workshop or segregated employment, which is to be discouraged under most circumstances. People working together sort of has many benefits, and has also the added benefit of helping to overcome stigma around disability in the workplace and in the wider society. Some groups we find face intensified barriers, and as women, for example, and some disability types, particularly mental and cognitive functional difficulties, are more difficult to reach than others, such as mobility or sensory impairment. Existing projects are all fairly small scale. They are limited numbers, and they still struggle with macro barriers to do with the poor transport systems, weakly enforced legislation, water, electricity, and so on. So we conclude the report with 8 main recommendations, which are especially sort of aimed at the Aid for Trade community, but which could have a wider relevance for any trade-related development assistance. In the slides that I'm going to show, the recommendations are loosely organized around the 3 main categories, Aid for Trade categories of trade policy and regulation, building productive capacity, and infrastructure. So in the area of trade policy and regulation, ensure that global trade rules are consistent with government commitments to protect and promote the rights of persons with disabilities, and support the active involvement of persons with disability and OPDs in aid for trade design and implementation and other trade policy arena more broadly. In the area of supporting building productive capacity, promote integrated approaches to employment policy and robust stakeholder engagement to generate decent jobs in global value chains, and develop local capacity to provide assistive technology products and services, and help firms in low-income countries to integrate into global AT markets. In the area of infrastructure, invest in physical infrastructure that complies with the universal principles, and promote accessibility, and reduce the digital divide. so that the inclusion of persons with disabilities in ICT-enabled international trade is possible. We also recommend to try and increase visibility of issues relevant to policy to persons with disability in trade documents, and obviously strengthen data analysis and monitoring. And on this last point, I like to conclude by sharing some initial thoughts on possible research ideas. Given that very little is known about the linkages between trade and persons with disabilities, some preliminary data scoping exercises could be a useful and necessary step. You might be aware there have been efforts to design survey questions to collect data on disability in recent years. The main initiative is by the so-called Washington Group on Disability Statistics, and my co-author, Professor Sophie Mitra, is part of this initiative. They have developed models that are integrated in national household surveys, and the ILO in particular has an LFS, Labor Force Survey Disability model, where they ask many useful questions. First, on what are the functional difficulties that persons face, whether it's difficulties in seeing, hearing, walking, and so on. But importantly, they focus on the barriers the persons face to access employment in general, and also the barriers that they face when in employment. Now, I'm acutely aware that there will be certainly issues of compatibility between, for example, custom data and employment data. There will be difficulties because different surveys define variables in slightly different ways. But I think it's an important effort to start doing. And I've sort of grouped ideas for research under the two broad themes of employment and assistive technology. So to start with, I think it would be interesting to understand whether the ranking of these barriers that workers with disability face in employment may vary by sector, let's say in agriculture, electronics, tourism, and whether the response to this question further vary depending on the gender of the respondents or the disability type. I suppose the overarching question I'd like to answer, I'm interested in, is whether export-oriented sectors offer a more or less conducive working environment to workers with disabilities compared to other sectors in a country. And of course, looking at then specific sectors that are export-oriented, sort of trying to trace whether workers with disability are able to gain employment in more dynamic sectors related to trade, for example, ICT. On assistive technology, the question, as I sort of alluded at earlier on in the presentation, to me, the key question is why is it that there's no more South-South trade on assistive technology products? Now, the WHO has a list of assistive technology products. And as I said, they vary a great deal in terms of the sophistication of these products, the way they are produced, whether they are so the value chains related to these products are fragmented or not, and so on. So UNCTAD has already started to try and match the list of WHO products to HS codes. And I have to say the results so far is not a straightforward task. But if this matching is possible for at least some products, it'd be interesting to see what are the flows, export imports, the level of tariffs, the level of non-tariff barriers on these products. An argument that I often hear is that the problem with assistive technology in developing countries is to do with very high tariffs. My sense is that actually that's not true for several products, and actually non-tariff barriers are more of an issue. But this is all questions out there that need to better verify defined and documented. And to end, these are just initial thoughts. I hope I'll continue brainstorming with my colleagues at UNCTAD, at the ILO, and I would very much welcome ideas and suggestions from you. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much indeed, Marzia. The Q&A box is open now for questions. I don't see any at the moment, but let me ask a couple. Although in a sense, you sort of answered some of the questions that occurred to me, which was, how common are some of the problems that you've identified? And, with your list of research topics at the end, in a sense, I think you're suggesting they're not very. I mean, we just don't have very much information. But I mean, to the extent of assistive technology, are there other examples where we've clearly got trade policy that is impeding assistive technology, or is it something that you just think it might be there and we need to look carefully?
Yes, thank you for your questions, Alan. Yours is it's a very good question. As I said, I think it's probably more fruitful to think about selected products rather than thinking of the block of assistive technology. And I'm thinking, for example, of the not of for example, wheelchairs or maybe screen readers, so the digital devices. What I've seen is that, as I actually mentioned, that the tariff issue is really not a big deal. In fact, I think government has recognized the importance of having some assistive devices. And I think, for example, even on wheelchairs, there is tariff exemption. But the issue for me is more to do with the fact that there is kind of a very high concentrated market on some of these assistive technology, and it is all in high income countries. And I have no idea why there is the issue of, for example, even the lack of ability of middle and low income countries to produce components, so that, for example, when a component needs to be replaced, there's long waits because the order needs to go back to the source and so on. So my sense is that there is a capacity in the South, and that aid for trade could really actually contribute significantly to develop this capacity better. And I really don't know what else to add. I think we do. It's fantastic that UNCTAD is starting to look more into these issues in terms of trade flows for individual products, in terms of the type of barriers there might be, so that we will be able to give you a better answer in a few months.
Yes, thank you very much, Marzia. I mean, I think that you're concerned that you say, look, there's you think you want to encourage South-South trade in assistive technology. I mean, is there evidence in a sense that South-South trade would help, other than actually what I think you're saying is that you want to see some production in developing countries? I mean, in other words, it's not necessarily obvious to me, that South Africa can import stuff from Vietnam with any more ease than it can import it from France. And so, in a sense, the trade pattern, I mean, I wonder to what extent is what you've got to say really focused on the trade pattern, as opposed to the pattern of supply and actually also demand, but we can come on to that later.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So my thinking in suggesting that has to do with two things. One, and I suppose this is an issue that applies to other contexts as well, that sort of there is a tendency to kind of shorten value chains, and perhaps these days shorter value chains. If you think about trade happening within Africa or within the southern part of Africa, maybe that's better, but that doesn't really apply to assistive technology. My main motivation for suggesting that is that I'm thinking about the aspect of assistive technology not being sufficiently adapted to the needs of people in developing countries. And my hope is that if there's a regional production, there's a greater awareness and understanding of what, the sort of the glitches with hearing aids, or the problem with connectivity linked to screen readers might be, because it's more clearly understood, it's less removed from the context of persons with disabilities. There's also, talking about trade, there's also on the other side of the demand, there's a lot of unmet needs, but also a lack of awareness, or maybe obviously affordability, there's another issue. But again, there's an initiative by UNICEF and the WHO around also creating greater awareness and trying to really increase both supply and demand to fulfill some of the unmet needs.
Okay, thanks. I've got a couple of questions coming up now on the screen. Michael Gazarek has asked. He's asked a question about data. We'll perhaps come to that later. But I think he noted that you're saying that we should be essentially promoting greater engagement by people with disabilities in global value chains, and he's drawing a distinction between contributing to the global value chain to locating yourself in production. So is the concern more about the ability to produce stuff that will enter these value chains, or something to do with disability and actually being able to be part of the value chain? Now, this is the business of production or business of trade again?
Well, I think the both issues are relevant, and so you are, if you are saying, if I understand correctly, where the issue is accessibility and ability to produce or to be engaged in employment in general, or whether that's specific to kind of a trade-related activities. I think it's a useful question, but perhaps it's useful also to look at these two aspects not as necessarily distinct. There is a sense of sort of a vulnerability of workers and business sort of entrepreneurs with disability, which sort of expose them to also greater exploitation by maybe unscrupulous intermediaries and so on. And even though this doesn't answer the question posed by Michael, I also would like to raise the issue of the place, the location of work, because the very little we know suggests that persons with disabilities tend to be, those who work tend to be home-based, and there's a lot of concerns around the fact that being at home means that there's less likelihood that some basic standards of accessibility, labor rights will be, it can be monitored. On the other hand, it is persons with disability themselves who would tell you that they do prefer to work from home because of the many barriers that exist in the outside world, going from transport, lack of reasonable accommodation in the workplace, and so on. But my hope is as we've seen in the context of labor standards and sort of gender, my hope is that perhaps the presence of export-oriented factories and greater compliance with labor standards might extend also to workers with disabilities. I'm realizing I'm talking about issues which are relevant, but are not necessarily answering Michael's question.
Okay, thanks. So a couple of other questions. The next one also from Michael in the order I got them on the screen. One of your recommendations was that we should make sure global trade rules are consistent with a sensitivity towards disability. Michael's sort of asking, as it were, the compliment. Have you got examples where international trade rules are actually antithetical? In other words, can we identify, in a sense, things that we could stop doing that were useful? In free trade agreements, in WTO agreements, or what? Can you, as it were, have you got any concrete examples where we can say, look, here is a simple win, just stop doing this thing, and things will improve?
Yeah, so there's been an interesting review recently that we report in our paper about the extent to which the text of trade agreements take into consideration the rights of persons with disabilities, in particular, the extent to which the text of trade agreement is aligned with the principle of the Convention of Persons with Disabilities. And we find that there's very little in trade agreements that deals with that. Mostly when persons with disabilities are included is in terms of defining some exemptions for government. And this brings me to the main point that comes to mind in answering Michael's question is there are issues to do with access to health services and access to also assistive technologies. If that, for example, something we didn't talk about before, something that if for example, some assistive technology is subject to intellectual property rights that limit their production and trade in low-income countries. Those are the sort of things that come to mind first of all. So it's really trying to protect the capacity of government to really reduce barriers for persons with disability. Most governments have issued legislation on promoting rights of persons with disability. So when formulating trade agreements, think of sort of protecting that capacity, particularly in the area of health and social services more broadly.
Okay, thanks. You mentioned IP, and that sort of takes me on to a question from Irini, which actually is something that struck me as you were talking. You never ever mentioned pharmaceuticals.
Yes.
And yet, for disability, quite often one needs medical interventions, not just of a physical nature, but of a pharmacological nature. Is there a reason for that? I mean, can you sort of, take us through that particular issue?
No. It's listed. I mean, we talk about medicines, and no, absolutely not. I haven't really kind of discussed in the presentation, but it's clearly a very important aspect too, precisely because many persons with disability face on average, kind of more complex long-term health needs. Yes, absolutely. It's very important.
Yeah. So, I mean, in a sense, if you thought that the world trading system was not perfect so far as medicines were concerned because of IP or possibly other dimensions. One of the things you could say is, well, that is likely to impinge disproportionately
Yes.
On the disabled.
Absolutely. I know it's a very controversial issue.
Yes, indeed.
So maybe that also was my, so I decided not to mention, but it is one important issue that have particular relevance for persons and workers with disabilities, definitely.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I would have thought, in a sense, it was something that was worth stressing, because the sort of conversations about IP and medicines tends to focus on COVID vaccines,
Yes.
HIV, and so on. And yet it may well be the case that it's also hindering disabled people with much less sophisticated or exciting medicines, just sort of fairly standard stuff, but nonetheless trading systems not helping.
Absolutely. Very good point. Yes.
Okay. Another question, actually, from Michael again. I mean, you're concerned about home working, and I think that's a very interesting dimension, because we typically imagine that home workers are rather low life forms in global value chains or just international trade in general. But one of the things that might assist home working, and ergo people who aren't, for instance, very mobile, would be the digitization. That actually digitalization might allow people to engage in more sophisticated economic activities from their homes that previously they weren't. I mean, is that something also that you've explained?
Yeah.
Explored?
So, yeah, it's a very good point. And it's true for probably some disability types more than others, and this is something we discuss about. I mean, as I also mentioned, existing projects tend to sort of persons with mobility difficulties tend to be easier to reach than others. So for people with functional difficulties in walking, kind of mobility, the digital solutions are definitely can be a good opportunity. There are issues to do with, however, people with other type of functional difficulties. Is sensory, people who are sort of blind, but also cognitive impairments. And their digital solutions are still possible, of course, but it's also important to take into consideration the fact that there's much higher costs for people. Like, you will have to buy, in addition to your laptop, a screen reader or a braille sort of a converter. And so the issue there is, yes, let's support this, but who is bearing the cost of these additional kind of gadgets that you do need in order to carry out the work? And then there's the usual broader issue of the extent to which platform workers are well paid or they are exposed to insecure working conditions, but that's a broader issue that obviously doesn't apply to workers with disability. I think in general, we tend to talk about persons with disability as a whole, but I've also learned that there's so much diversity, and perhaps it's important to take this issue as a broad issue, but also to then understand the specificities of particular groups and the challenges that they face.
Yes, indeed. That feels entirely plausible. Well, look, we tried to adhere to a hard stop at 2:00. We're sort of trying, we're fitting this thing into a convenient hour, and the witching hour has more or less come. So let me say thank you. I don't know if there's any last words you want to say to reinforce the message.
No, it's been really wonderful to have this opportunity to come have a conversation with you, to hear other people's views, and I hope we will continue to talk about these issues. I'm going to report back to the working group that is formed by various colleagues at the ILO UNCTAD, and I will keep you up to date with progress. But this in itself, this conversation will be useful for me to kind of engage with them in the next few months.
Well, thank you very much. It's been very interesting for us, and if we've been useful as well, that's even better. So thank you very much again. And to everybody, thank you for coming. Have a good Easter. We will be back after the break with more interesting dimensions of international trade. So goodbye and thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.